All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Fireside chat with some first movers in freight. I'm Anthony Sutardja, CEO of Parade, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this, what should be an insightful discussion with two industry pioneers who have been at the forefront of a lot of the freight tech revolution. One of our first guests is one of our own, Derek Netelenbos. He's had an extensive background in building and leading strategic sales, BD, partnerships, and most recently, prior to Parade, he served as the director of partnerships at Convoy, playing a critical role in driving the industry's adoption for API-based pricing. And our second guest, David Landau. He's been a supply chain executive for over 25 years, creating and delivering products, strategies, M&A, driving team development. He previously served as the chief product officer of BluJay Solutions, where he's led the product transformation of the creation of their data networks and application strategy. And prior to that, most recently, he was the chief network and strategy officer at Transporeon, where he led the overall Transporeon ecosystem. So great to have you both, David and Derek. Throughout this fireside chat, we're going to delve into some current trends. We're going to discuss some of the evolution of the spot market that we're seeing with just from the first movers perspectives here, and explore some of the essential technologies shaping the future of freight brokerage. And they'll both provide some of their individual insights. We encourage everyone attending to just drop in the Q&A any sort of questions. We won't be answering them throughout the fireside chat, but at the very end, we'll allocate 5 minutes of time to just group all the questions and address them one by one to provide the most comprehensive answer. So without further ado, let's just jump into this discussion here. Derek and David, thank you again for joining us today. Let's start by discussing your perspectives on the current freight market environment, factors contributing to what is, I think, a pretty prolonged period of low rates right now. And I could tee it up for us. I think I was just reading an article from Jason Miller on SCM, and he lists a series of factors of why low rates have really been prolonged due to like manufacturing and new home sales. I would encourage you to read the article. There's a lot of different reasons, but what caught my attention was the excess of capacity sticking around for two reasons. One, the emergence of actually a lot of more brokers becoming efficient and keeping trucks moving. And then another second cited reason was just the excess profits from 2021, enabling a lot of the carriers to pay down their debts and really crank it through during this time period. But as we talk to a lot of freight brokers, thinking through this environment, a lot of them are thinking about responsibly growing or maintaining their volumes. And what they may not have considered oftentimes is the shift in spot procurement in general in this industry. And so there's this industry trend, I think, that spot procurement has generally changed and people may not be aware of. Was also just unpacking, I think it was Chris Kalpis, Kalpis, who
Capless.
Kalpis, who did an article out there in or a paper with one of the research groups at MIT, and then I was two insights was that shipper direct freight from direct to spot freight pre-pandemic to now has grown from 4% to 12%, and it seems to be here to stay. It actually hasn't gone back and reverted back to the mean. It's more and more shippers are leveraging strategic opportunities in the spot market. And then furthermore, there was an analysis done on just, the freight markets are cyclical, and spot as a percentage of the total amount of freight out there is routing guide failure, and then also direct to spot as well. But that total sum in previous freight market recessions, that seemed to peak out at 11%. 11% of all freight volumes was in the spot market. And right now we're actually sitting at about 20% according to the data published by this. And so what that tells me, and I'm curious to get both your takes here, Derek and David, is the trend doesn't seem to be cyclical in that there is this movement towards more and more strategic leverage off of the spot market, and would love your unique insights there. Maybe David, if you could help unpack first.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, Anthony. I appreciate the intro, and I think it is a very interesting time here, and we do wonder: are we at the cusp of a change? Are we starting to see the kind of the green shoots of growth and improvement in the rates? Nonetheless, I think a lot of things have factored into what's going on right now. I'll speak to it from a shipper perspective, and I'll let Derek kind of speak to it from a brokerage perspective. Uh, if I think about it from a shipper perspective, in the past, the spot market was something you used when you had to, right? It was fairly tedious and painful in that you'd have to basically, if you had a TMS that supported a spot market, you pushed it out and you maybe to 5 or 10 carriers or brokers. You got your responses in over an hour or two. You might negotiate back and forth. And the process and the time for managing a load and managing a spot load was 3 or 4 hours in terms of clock time. And it is, probably 15, 20, minutes worth of actual kind of work time, if you would. And if you look at now, a lot of the more sophisticated brokers are out there using technology like Parades and others where they're doing the API-based rating, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But what that's done is that makes that process much more seamless. And we can talk about that as well. But in essence, it's encouraged the use of spot market more strategically on a day-to-day basis, if that makes sense, as opposed to just as a fallback measure. And I remember when I was at Transport, we had a lot of conversations with our customers in Europe. And the question was oftentimes, what percentage of my freight volume should go to the spot market? And there's never an exact answer for everybody because it varies based on industry and portfolio lanes and so forth. Nonetheless, an 80-20 rule is probably pretty good, where 80% of your volume is going to be on contract and 20% is taking advantage of the spot market, both for savings opportunities as well as for there's just places where I'm not going to have contract rates. I think if you'd asked somebody this 5 years ago, you probably would have said 90-10 or even more so. And so I think there's a lot of impetus to use the spot market much more dynamically now and much more, I'll call it deliberately, than there might once have been.
In this shift towards more of the spot market or more deliberate use of it, Derek, rewinding time back to the early days of the starts of Convoy, I think Convoy's credited with the start of driving a lot of this API-based pricing for more spot market usage. Would you be able to share, an introduction of like what it is and what is that new standard that has transformed how many brokers operate today?
Yeah, sure. So back in the day, it was the first thing I worked on at Convoy. And the way we had originally done this, TMSs weren't equipped to consume an API rate at the time. And so unless it was highly, highly customized. So we had a couple large shippers that we were basically dumping large CSV files to several times a day, and they would manually input that into their TMS. Once we proved that model out, we went to several of the TMSs, and BluJay at the time was one of the more forward-looking ones, and we actually developed a protocol and a connection to consume spot rates. I think what was really interesting about that API rating, though, was the flexibility and how quickly the shippers that were taking advantage of that were able to manipulate it and use it in different ways, right? And it almost created this new category that was, here's your routing guide, here's your API rates, and then here's spot. So the first kind of use case was the routing guide fails, then we immediately make the rate call for the API rate. Over time, that turned into, hey, let's call the API rate in parallel for price discovery and see where that stacks up against our contract rates. Or let's call that rate in parallel, so we can execute on it right away if something happens to our primary carrier, backup carriers. And then, especially when the pandemic hit, we saw a lot of shippers start to leverage the API rate in lieu of a contract rate, especially on volatile lanes where they couldn't commit to certain daily volumes or weekly volumes. And so the spot rate became a replacement for that commitment. And so we saw it be used in a lot of different ways. And I think to your point on the paper that you cited earlier, that kind of mirrors what the data shows is that, hey, going direct to spot, going from 4 to 12% and not coming back, it's because this API rate is being used in more creative ways. And I don't even know if we call it spot anymore to some extent. It's kind of this intermediary.
Yeah, it's a big shift in how things are being done. David, you have a unique perspective from all the different shipper TMSs out there. How do you, like, are we in the early innings of this? Like, how are you seeing adoption of this type of technology, or even just it being deployed by the shippers that have access to this technology?
It's a great question. And actually, before I answer that, I do want to kind of add on to what Derek talked about, which is from the shipper perspective of that more kind of dynamic approach. One of the things that I've seen from the shipper TMS perspective, I think it's important for our brokerage listeners here to understand this, is it's all about what kind of information can we provide the shippers to make the right decision? Do I go with a contract rate? Which of my dynamic rates do I go with? And one of the very first things that we did, even in my cloud logistics days, was we actually fed, in this case, it was DAT data, but in BluJay, it was actually the BluJay benchmark data. And so now as I'm looking at my routing guide and I'm figuring out how am I going to actually pick a carrier for a particular load, I'm looking at my 4 contract rates. I might be looking at my 3 dynamic rates, but I'm also looking at my benchmark rate. Because what that might tell me is, is my contract rate a good one? And I prefer to go to my contract rate if I can, because I've got committed volumes and so forth. I'll know if it's a good one relative to the benchmark rate or not. And are my dynamic rates good? Or do I need to go out to my traditional spot market because my dynamic rates might not be as good as I know I can get with the benchmark? And so it's about providing those shippers as much information as possible, just like your brokers are trying to get as much information as possible, both in terms of what their buy rates potentially are going to be with technology like parades, but also, sell rates, but what would the buy rates be based off of the benchmarks and so forth. Specific to your question, I think, Derek, I appreciate the compliments on BluJay and being forward thinking. I think if you look across the board right now, this is becoming a de facto standard in the sense that I know one TMS I spoke with recently has as many as 70 different carriers who are hooked in for dynamic rates. Most that I've talked to are somewhere in that 15 to 20 range. And so it's on one hand, that API and that connectivity is really important because that's how you get access to those loads as a broker. On the other hand, it's to some extent becoming a bit of table stakes as well, because if you've got 15 or 20 brokers or carriers, because there's some asset-based carriers who do this now as well, all with the rate, the rate API and the dynamic connections, it still comes back to the strategic relationships. Just because you're connected, just because you're providing a rate, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get that more volume. You still have to have the relationship. It's not just about the people and automation that enables it. The automation, it's the people as well. And so I do think the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? The automation's taking over, but the more it's taken over, the more dependent on we are for the people to actually build those relationships to make it matter.
Right. No, it's core to have the people leverage some of these technologies. All being said, how's the technologies keeping up with the shift? And it does seem like there's this shift that's not only a new standard, but is transforming how things are being moved or transacted across shipper and broker. And want to turn the attention, to you, David, just given your experiences in supply chain technology and your various roles. could you share some of the insights as you look at some of the essential technologies that are going to shape the future of what makes a great future freight brokerage in the perspective of some of these shipper TMS ecosystems looking downwards and connecting to the suppliers?
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. If I think about these technologies, of course, we all go straight to the math, right? We go to how am I calculating rates? How am I calculating, benchmark standards and so forth? And the math is absolutely important, right? The math is what's going to ultimately drive a lot of the ROI. At the same token, the math gaps aren't so wide that they aren't unbridgeable. And so I think, we all need to have great math, great algorithms, great AI to drive good answers, but good answers alone don't drive good adoption. And this is where I think some of the technologies that Parade is actually working on are really important. It's the adoption is how I'm going to get my users to be as effective as possible. If I think about what a lot of our brokerage and frankly shipper customers are facing right now, it's the classic supply chain labor shortage, right? It's how do I hire the right people? How do I keep them? How do I deal with the turnover? Because there's always high turnover rates in a lot of these spaces. And so that's where I think technology comes into play. I think if you look at what a lot of people are thinking about when it comes to AI, as an example, is automation. How can I take people out of the equation? And I would argue that it's not about taking people out of the equation. It's about making people better, faster. And that's where I start thinking about augmentation. Great solutions that get great adoption aren't making me unnecessary. What they're doing is making me more effective more quickly. And so that way, I'm not dependent upon a team of people who've been working with my brokerage firm or my shipper TMS for the last 10 years and have all that built up tribal knowledge and experience. Let the system, let the technology be the tribal knowledge and allow my users to get up to speed much more quickly. And as a business, that means I'm servicing my customers more effectively. It means I'm going to be more profitable. And it also puts me in a less risky position because I know that I'm not dependent on a handful of people who've been there for 20 years, that I can bring in new talent and become effective. And that's both in terms of risk mitigation, but it's also how I can scale. And so I think if you think about technology, yeah, again, that math is important, but how can I use it to augment my team to make them effective? Because by the way, it's those people that create those strategic relationships I touched on earlier, not the technology by itself.
It mirrors a lot of how we think about the tooling throughout what's needed for the broker to succeed in a digital first environment where, if we were to break out the core problems that Parade is solving, it's around how do I understand my capacity network? And then how do I make sure, as you guys mentioned, the shipper actually knows of my price? Like what can my brokerage specifically do based off the capacity that the firm has worked so hard to procure? And so really, I think there's like 5 different components there. There's capacity, there's pricing, there's connectivity, there's automation, as well as the analytics behind it. And, in each one of those pieces, there's a very manual grunt work component to getting things done, which may not necessarily, this is where a lot of the technology leverage has been applied here at Parade. And then it's also then the tooling to then help the end user, the broker in this case, really be able to make strategic decisions on top of that. And like, how easy is it to then really leverage the automation to accomplish strategic goals? For example, on the capacity side, we look at it from reducing manual grunt work from emails and phone calls. And if that was taken off the table, well, what does a strategic carrier relationship management really look like in understanding excess capacity? How does my network match up and pair up with a shipper's network? How does that factor in then into pricing? Pricing beforehand without some of these technologies might look like going into shouting across the floor, going into a Slack channel, sending an email chain to a bunch of carrier sales reps to understand the market pulse of the price. Well, this is where like technology can really be leveraged to then gather the data, pull it into one place, start analyzing it, and just accelerate the decision-making process for driving confident pricing. Because that, as you're pointing out, David, the technology is one part, the math and accuracy is just one piece of it, but then how does it actually get applied into an automated workflow and in a way that is how the shipper for a broker ultimately wants to leverage it. I think that's like the key point there as well.
Yeah, and I don't think that can be under the focus on the relationship is really critical, right? Because at Convoy, when we were supplying API rates, that wasn't happening in a vacuum with us trying to win new shippers. We had very strategic relationships with those shippers that facilitated that type of connection. And so, I think we're still a little bit a ways away from, some pure play marketplace where brokers and shippers are being introduced on the fly because of a rate. That relationship is still hugely important. And I think the real-time rating just allows the frontline folks to focus on the more valuable work and, quite frankly, the more interesting work for them. And that addresses part of the churn problem that David mentioned.
That actually reminds me of we're just debriefing with a customer on some of the API rating that they're doing against their shippers, and some of the shippers they just take a very tactical relationship based approach on hey, we've turned this on to help expose our capacity to you quickly over API. Some of them were out the gate. This is already the norm. Let's go. This is amazing that you're doing this. Others require this conversation like, hey, look, this is what we're doing. This is how we're actually being able to leverage our capacity information. And then they saw the bid volumes go up from 9 a day to 100 a day. Like, what's going on here? Can you actually service this? Is this really serviceable? And so I think that's where the relationship of even just being able to explain, like, this is how we're doing this, and this is the capacity that's backing it as well, goes to, and both of your guys' point that it's a much more nuanced relationship than hands off the wheel, more so a tool of the relationship. Both very valuable insights. I would love to, hear more from each one of you, Derek and David, about your experiences on how you've seen this actively deployed in real world scenarios. Derek, you already touched on a little bit of it, but David, from your perspective, where do you think we're at right now?
I would tell you, I think we're in kind of that classic adoption curve of technology where shippers, at least from their perspective, have access to this third type of rate to think about in the terms that the Derek outlined, which is that dynamic rate. And I'm not sure if they quite understand what that ultimately means in terms of what their portfolio should, or what their profile of shipping should look like. I think ultimately this will roll back upstream to some extent as well to the procurement process. If you think about that process for the longest time, freight procurement to build out those contract rates was an annual process. Usually it was in Q1, and you went through that bidding process to figure out what your contract's for the rest of the year. I think we're seeing newer technologies that have emerged and newer ideas that have emerged around doing that more often, whether it's seasonally, whether it's looking at doing a procurement on a select set of lanes that are not performing particularly well, usually because of service issues or maybe price issues. But we don't have kind of a generally accepted methodology of when and how to procure rates. And I think this actually makes it more complicated, because now my volumes I might have expected in my original routing guide bidding process, I may not be hitting those volumes. I may be going in different areas using carriers or brokers I wasn't expecting to use before. And so I do think we're in that learning phase. I think it's not just shippers. I think it's strategists. I think it's brokers understanding how to best service those shippers when they have these engagements for procurement. But I think there's a lot to be learned over the course of the next 2 or 3 years to understand how this new dynamic rating changes how I think about who are my strategic carriers and strategic brokers as a shipper for the next year and how I best leverage them. Derek, if you feel differently about that or not.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, where you tend to see a lot of activity, or where we've seen a lot of activity in this space in its short history, is when the market is volatile, right? Because that's when one of the participants in that transaction is either exploring or exploiting. Yeah, maybe a harsh word to say exploit, but when the markets are going up, activity in spot is frothy, and that's where you're gonna see a lot of activity with dynamic rating, API based rating, and when it's coming down, you've got shippers that are performing price discovery, and they want to make sure that their contract rates are still in line or still reasonable. That being said, most industry folks believe that we're on an uptick here, but it's slow, right? And what's driven this type of kind of activity has been the real volatility. So for better or worse, to the extent we see some increase in rates, which would be great for the brokerages, I think that's going to drive a lot of activity and experimentation out of necessity. And what we typically tried to get our shippers on board with when markets were a little bit flatter was, hey, let's get your house in order, because what we know about the freight industry is it does a lot of this, right? And when it's starting to do this, if you don't have a solution for that other than bringing more bodies on, especially now as we're starting to see the adoption of these API rates, you're probably going to lose share or lose out.
Yeah, I think that if there was one number that I would like to keep an eye on as at least as a technology provider to shippers historically, is I look at the tender accept rate. And I think if you look at the kind of the peak of when things were really tight in capacity, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 25, 27%. The tender reject rate was somewhere in 25 to 27%, meaning that a quarter of the time I had to go either to a secondary or tertiary carrier or to the spot market. And then I think at the trough of the rates, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 3%. And that means 97% of the time I was not even needing to think about the spot market. So I do think that it's when you're in those peaks and troughs where the spot market and this dynamic rating can be used most strategically by both sides. It's when you kind of find that, called stasis, when you're sitting there somewhere around 8 to 10%, which is historical norms, that you should do what you said, Derek, kind of get your house in order. But there should be strategies off of that one particular number, the tender reject rate, of how I handle a tight capacity market. How do I recognize if that capacity is staying tight, getting worse, or loosening up, and how I handle the reverse situation as well.
In some of the more real world applications right now, Derek, maybe from the back in the day at Convoy, where do we see it, even just from like a productivity standpoint? Is it like X% of spot freight has been now driven through API quoting, or is it like more bids per day per person? How are you able to quantify some of the success?
Yeah, so I think at the peak when Convoy was operating, of all of our kind of transactional non-contracted freight, 30 to 40% of it was coming and getting sourced through these dynamic rates. It was, and Convoy was probably not a good analogous to most brokers, because for the amount of freight we were doing, we didn't have a lot of human brokers. They were mostly handling the fringe cases. Most of it was algorithmically matched and done. But on the spot side, about 35% was coming through this mechanism of API rate request and submission.
Gotcha, that's quite a significant amount. David, I'm curious if you've got any insights into what success has looked like for a lot of these brokers deploying some of this tech.
what I would say is, I think kind of building what Derek talked about, two of the metrics, and I don't know what the benchmarks should be, but two of the metrics I would suggest, brokers think about as they're going through this digitization journey is what percentage of your demand and what percentage of your capacity is digital. Now, I've talked to some of the larger digital freight brokers in the past, and Derek, you may have a different perspective coming from Convoy, but I remember them telling me that they got to the point where 80-90+% of their demand was all digital, meaning they weren't having to deal with the emails and the phone calls. It was all going through either the APIs or their website, but they never got above like 30-ish, 35% of their capacity being digital. So they were still dialing for dollars or dialing for trucks, as DAT would say. And if I think about success and the success metrics for a broker, those are kind of the two metrics I would be thinking about, because the more I can get those numbers higher, the more I can spend less time on the grunt work, as you called it, Anthony, and more time on those relationships and the exceptions and servicing the customers and generating new leads and so forth. So I would look at those two numbers as being benchmarks that I would consider being part of my quarterly analysis if I'm a broker digitizing to see what kind of progress am I making.
Yeah, we'd agree at those two metrics as well. Well, thank you both for sharing those real world applications and stories. It's clear that there's been a lot of change over the past few years in freight technology, and I think we're just getting started. As we wrap today, I do want to express my gratitude to both David and Derek for sharing their invaluable experiences. I think some of the key takeaways here is that the spot market has experienced a change in how it's being used strategically. It seems like we all agree that API-based pricing and real-time connectivity is setting the new standard, but also becoming table stakes, even to just be a tool in the relationship with a shipper. And at the end of the day, it's really about adopting and leveraging some of these essential technologies with your people to make the most out of them. And so as you reflect on the insights shared today, encourage you to explore new strategies, technologies that might be able to help your org stay ahead of the market. Any further questions, feel free to reach out to Parade team, myself, and if you've got questions for David or Derek, we'd be happy to follow up offline. Thank you, everyone.